Hello my friends, my name is Artur and I am an Estonian YouTuber. Last time we watched a video about resources of the Second World War. We found out that America was rich, Soviet Union was poor, Britain was rich, Germany was pretty rich, France was pretty okay rich, and everybody else was pretty poor back then. So that's the main point I got out of that video. Today we are watching lend-lease. You know, this is the continuation of the resource war, I guess. I found out that this series has 4 parts made by extra credits, which makes it incredibly fun. So yeah, it's gonna be enjoyable. Also, Kisu, instead. My cat is going crazy, look. Kisu. Oh yeah. Bad kitty cat. Also guys, I want to thank you. Last time I mentioned that I might have to close down my store because no one buys the mug. And 2 of you bought the mug, yeah! Buy the cup, I'll keep the store up. Yeah, I'm a rapper now. Anyway, thank you for buying the cup, and also thank you to all the patrons who have supported this channel. You guys are the reason I can keep going while YouTube revenue is down. Thank you. But now let's see what lend-lease is.
The year is 1941. World War II is entering its 3rd year. France has collapsed, and Great Britain is barely holding on, a last bulwark of democracy against the tide of fascism. Dictatorship rules Europe, and the sleeping giant of the United States has yet to wake. With the collapse of France in 1940, the situation in Europe becomes clear. Without resources from the U.S., all resistance to the Nazi military machine would collapse, no matter how bravely the small island nation of Britain tried to hold out. But America was opposed to war. In fact, it goes further. America was opposed to any intervention at all. In the 1930s, the U.S.
It's so weird seeing this. Like, we're used to America, expansionist America that uses almost every opportunity to, you know, get oil or influence upon another country or another world part. But in this one, their policy was truly different, their foreign policy. It changed after the Second World War, but now they're still like in this virgin state, unruined by the world.
The U.S. had passed the Neutrality Act, which not only established that it wasn't going to get involved with foreign wars, but went further with the prevailing American isolationism of the time and declared that America wasn't going to sell arms to nations at war. President Roosevelt saw the threat that Nazi Germany posed and desperately wanted to find ways to support the British war effort, but the Neutrality Acts kept his hands tied. When Czechoslovakia fell, he lobbied Congress to renew an old provision in the Neutrality Acts called cash and carry, but his efforts were rebuffed. Then Poland fell, and things started to look grim. Finally, on November 5th, 1939, cash and carry was renewed. But cash and carry was a limited provision. It allowed for the sale of material to Britain and France, but only if they paid in cash for the material and transported it all back to Europe themselves. No U.S. ship was to enter a war zone. At first, this worked, but...
Wait, but did they change the Neutrality Act? Because right now, hell no, they're not neutral. So, did they change it, or what happened with the law? I mean, of course, I know they can change the law, I just don't know if they did it. Maybe they still run under the Neutrality Act, but they found some kind of a loophole in it, and they're, you know, using that. It's possible in the legal system.
As the years dragged on and France fell, Britain found itself hemorrhaging its reserves. The Battle of Britain and the campaigning in North Africa had been bleeding it dry. There simply was no more cash in the UK, and even the British fleet was being stretched thin. In 1940, Roosevelt established a policy allowing the trade of destroyers to the British in exchange for bases in British colonies. This policy was definitely pushing the limits of the Neutrality Acts, but...
Okay, exchange for bases in the British colonies. Why are the bases important? Why would America need bases back then? If it was neutral, why do you need your troops to be on other grounds? Is this the start of expansionism? Or we already go out? I don't know. It's weird. If you're American, explain it to me. You're a neutral country. Why would you trade the right to have bases on another country's ground for ships?
But technically, it wasn't violating the terms of cash and carry because the British were trading for the ships rather than buying them. And hey, ships do a pretty good job of transporting themselves, so there you go. This deal really shows the desperation of the situation, though. Roosevelt risked a potentially illegal action because everyone, his staff, and even much of the British staff saw the capitulation of the British Empire as inevitable. In 1940, everyone thought Britain was on the ropes, mere weeks from being taken down. And so, as a last Hail Mary, this destroyers for bases deal put US bases on British colonies so that they wouldn't simply fall into Nazi hands. But fortunately...
Yeah, of course. I didn't think about it. US bases would defend... But that it's again so against the Neutrality Act. If you put your troops and your bases in the war zone, you are not neutral. I guess Roosevelt didn't want to be neutral. Just the law was in his way, and the democratic process is too slow to just change the law, which dictatorships can do like that, but democratic governments cannot. That's one minus of the democratic governments, actually. But yeah, so he found a way to help Britain almost illegally, barely legally.
The Battle of Britain was won, and now the US had to enter into more long-term thinking. It was time for lend-lease. This is one of the critical turning points in the Second World War. It's right up there with the German invasion of the Soviet Union and the United States finally deciding to fully commit to war. Without lend-lease, the UK almost certainly would have fallen. Fascists would gain control over all of Europe, and even if the US later decided to enter the war, they'd have no jumping-off point for a European campaign. But lend-lease...
Yeah, imagine that. If US had to invade Europe without D-Day, they would have to D-Day British soil already over the Atlantic, without the help of the British. I think maybe they could have done it, but it would be so much more difficult.
At last meant that the complete industrial power of the US would be committed to combating the Nazi war machine. With lend-lease, the US had finally picked a side. You see, the idea behind lend-lease was simple. The US would give its strategic partners, and I say strategic partners because they're not allies yet, massive amounts of war material for the duration of the war, after which these strategic partners were supposed to give that material back. Funny thing about war material, though, not a lot of it tends to come back in the same condition you lent it out in. And the US knew this. This was essentially the largest donation of war material in the history of mankind. And it wasn't just tanks and bombs, it was foodstuffs and telephone cabling. It was trucks and clothing. Heck, the US even shipped 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 train cars over to the U.S.A. to bolster their rail infrastructure.
Yeah, I remember learning about this. US sent a lot of stuff, like millions of tons of equipment, civilian equipment even, and food to the U.S.A., the Soviet Union. I want to know if they ever gave anything of it back. Because as soon as the war ended, they almost immediately became enemies. So I wonder if they ever gave it back. It was lend-lease, so you have to give it back, right? Or if the Soviet Union ever paid for anything the US gave them. U.S.A. gave, I think, 10 million cans of meat. Really, 10 million cans of meat to USSR in the 40s, right? And some of these cans were used in the Soviet military in the 70s. They didn't go bad because they're on area, they were closed, air sealed, they didn't go bad. I mean, I think they would taste horrible after 30 years, but it was the Soviet Union, so they ate it. And they didn't give it back, of course you wouldn't give back canned of meat, but they used it so long, meaning that how rich the USA was. One act of kindness could feed the Soviet Union's army, at least some parts of its army, for 30 years, which is crazy.
This was a huge portion of the US economy going to cover the material cost of the war while other nations were carrying the bulk of the human cost. And the sheer size of this effort is indescribable. It helped to drag the US out of the Great Depression and galvanized American production. It meant sending millions of tons overseas, shipping on a scale heretofore unimaginable during times of war. It meant giving away more goods than the entire world would have been able to produce annually a mere 75 years before. But like all things, this decision wasn't as straightforward as we sometimes like to think of it. Looking back on it today, it's easy to see the results of this Herculean task and how fully America threw herself into the effort, and just assume that the entire nation was unified behind this cause, that it had broad support. But democracies are, by design, messy things, and even on the issue of lend-lease, voting in the US Congress was split almost exactly down party lines. But once the measure was passed, America really did embrace this decision to truly be the arsenal of democracy, to be the engine of war for the anti-fascist world. And that leads me to a particular group I'd like to talk about. A group who's too rarely remembered and celebrated. A group whose battles were rarely glorious. They never took cities or gained territory, but they're the group of Americans who risked their lives earliest and sacrificed the most. They had higher casualty percentages than any of the other American armed services during the war, and they, very arguably, saved the free world. I would like to take this moment to acknowledge the service of the Merchant Marine. These are the men and women who serve as sailors to transport goods during wartime. They served in unarmed civilian ships, hauling necessary supplies to Allied forces throughout the war. Sailing the Atlantic, every day they faced the harrowing dread of the submarine. At any moment, they might lose their lives to an unseen and invisible vessel far below.
Yeah, I mean, you were in a civilian ship with no defenses, basically, against U-boats, submarines. Damn, these guys were brave. I hope they were paying them good.
Below the waves. They served simply as prey, unable to fight back against an enemy that might at any time strike without warning. To die asphyxiating in a steel tomb or freezing in the unforgiving waters of the Atlantic are horrors that no one would want to face, and yet these sailors faced that every day. Not for glory, but simply because it was a job that needed to be done. And these threats were so real and omnipresent that the merchant marine became one of the first uses of statistical operations research. The frequency of attacks on the merchant marine presented enough data for decisions to be made about the optimal size of a convoy and the escort it might require. Evidence all gathered off the backs of broken ships and drowned sailors. But despite all of this, many...
Sounds like the Soviet Union, you know. Statistics. Stalin said, death of one man is a tragedy, death of 1,000,000 or 1,000 is statistics, just a number.
Of the men and women of the merchant marine signed up for voyage after voyage, returning to the seas to make sure that the material of lend-lease always got through. And though the U.S. wouldn't officially enter the war for 9 more months, lend-lease made members of the merchant marine some of the first U.S. citizens to give their lives for the Allied cause in World War II. And in doing so, though their sacrifice is rarely celebrated, they helped change the course of history. Join us next week as we look more closely at how the lack of specific natural resources drove Axis policy.
I want to see that, yes. Next time we will watch that. I'm gonna just speed through this series, 4 videos, 4 reactions. I hope you guys like it, because it's gonna be 2 more videos about this. Yeah, no one celebrates or no one honors the groups that actually in war did as much as the soldiers in the front, for example, wives. The wives of the soldiers who were left home and sometimes worked in the factories because there were no men. So no one celebrates them. No one celebrates the lend-lease people, the captains, the sailors. No one talks about them. They did as much. They did it before the troops landed even in D-Day. So this is so cool. It opens up your perspective on the world. I suggest everybody should watch these videos. You know, change the one-sidedness of people's thinking. They think there's only one side to history. This opens up more. I would love to see these videos also on German side and on Soviet side. I want to read 2 names who bought the cups. I'm so glad you did it. Thank you so much. Mark Rushing, thank you for getting the cup. And Richard Kenny, thank you for getting the cup. Both are American, of course you are, because you guys, as we've seen this video, you guys are rich as hell. In Europe, no, people don't buy my stuff from Europe, because they don't have money. I don't know. Europe is weird with spending money, I guess. You from the USA, wanna drink tea from a cool cup, or beer, or whatever you drink, whiskey, get the cup. Links in the description below. Damn, it tastes good in this cup. Support the channel by being a patron. Sometimes the algorithm doesn't share my videos with all my subscribers. Actually, most of the times it never does. So I don't get views, I don't get, that means the revenue goes down, but what keeps it afloat is Patreon or PayPal. I live out of those, and they really do help. So I want to thank all of them who are already patrons, but you can also join it and be brave like these lend-lease captains. Keep this war effort afloat. Thank you very much. And as always, my friends, until my next video, stay cool and bye bye.